The moment of reckoning. I welcome you to the world's first Symposium on the topic of versions, implementations, Ruby, Rails. Casting a pretty wide net, but I want to narrow it down. I'll give you a context for it. Now, what is a Symposium? A Symposium is, oh, by the way, I was a little bit reluctant to put the plural because there's only one so far, but looking optimistically, maybe there'll be more. A town meeting-like gathering for the purpose of exploring one or more topics of common interest. Town meeting means, I know that it's sort of against the odds to take a very kind of, theater and stage setup and think of it as kind of a collective, almost seminar, but, let's go for broke. We'll try it. And we have microphones and everything, right? A non-hierarchical forum for questions and answers among interested parties and knowledge seekers. And non-hierarchical just means, I suppose technically I'm sort of up here and you're down there, but other than me, we're all equal here. And really, since what we're trying to explore is the whole area of Ruby versions, Ruby implementations, Rails versions, and how it all fits together. So, it's a topic that I think kind of circulates, kind of chases its own tail a bit, because, what Ruby you're using, what Rails you're using, and exactly how they fit together, will vary. And I also think it's something that a lot of people have had questions about. And a lot of people in the room also have answers. And what I encourage is, if people have questions, to bring them up. I do have some things I want to kind of, semi-present or say or ask you. But those of you who have experience, if somebody brings up something, whether it's me or someone else, and you have, good, bad, or indifferent, if you've had experience with something, by all means, please jump in and say something. So we're talking about things like, and enjoy this, because I almost never use shadow and different fonts and stuff. So, sort of, it's like letting me loose with Ajax. It's like everything shrinks and fades. Anyway, like which Ruby are you using? What would you like to know about different versions? What should you be using? What's being targeted among Rails core developers, among the Ruby spec developers, and I might tap somebody to talk a little bit about the Ruby spec project if there's anyone here who has their finger really on the pulse of that. But just to give you a little bit of a sense of where we're at, we have at the moment, in terms of Ruby, and this is just versions. I'm not even talking about implementations. I'm actually, for the moment, talking mostly about versions. Because I think the fact that there are different Ruby versions out there and a little bit of kind of unclarity in some people's minds about what they should be using and so forth. I think the different implementations, quite deservedly, have been getting a lot of press and a lot of discussion and usage, JRuby and Rubinius in particular, and I think that's great. But the version issue, just the numbering, the sequence of Ruby versions, is kind of a kind of counterpoint theme to the implementations theme, and it's a very important one. 1.8.6 is kind of, at least for me, kind of my home base Ruby. That's what I've been using. That's what I am using. 1.8.7 has come out, and it is essentially 1.8 with a lot of 1.9 stuff backported to it. The stated purpose of it, but stated by Mats explicitly, is to help with migrating to Ruby 1.9. There's some question, and this is something I'd be interested in hearing your either questions or answers about on this. There's some question in a lot of our minds as to whether we really need a whole 1.8 version that's kind of helping us to 1.9 or not. My impression, not to get too down, but my impression, just from a lot of kind of talking to people, is that 1.8.7 is not really gaining traction. was actually a little bit surprised to see it in a recent Ubuntu release. I mean, I have nothing against 187. It's a little bit, for me, a little bit kind of caught in the middle. 1.90 was the first release of 1.9. It's not in, I mean, it's basically a kind of development version, although one thing that I think a lot of us have had trouble with is getting a fix on whether 1.9 point anything is going to be a really sort of full-blooded production release. 1.90, I would say, is not. And it is, leading eventually toward 1.2. And finally, 1.91, well, 1.90 was released, Christmas? Or was it after Christmas? I can't remember. But 1.91 is due for a feature freeze on September 25th and to be released around Christmas and expected to be more stable. And again, I'm actually personally, for all that I try to follow this stuff, I am not entirely clear as to whether 1.91 is going to be regarded as a kind of production deployable release or just a somewhat more mature kind of interim release on the way to 2.0. Now, lest this not come alive for you, I have prepared, now we're going to put Amazon Web Services to the test. I have prepared an EC2 image. It's actually one that I've been working on for my training purposes, but I've set it up today, and it's not one of the big CPU ones, so well, whatever, we'll see. What I've done is I've set up for you an instance of this EC2 image that has Ruby's 186, 187, and 190 running on it. So if you want to play around with them now, I mean, as we speak, what you need to do is you need to go to, whoops, I don't know how to get this bigger. Can you read this URL? Okay, if you go to 2008.rubyconf.org/ec2.txt, you'll find instructions for logging on to the EC2 instance. Now, there are 15 users, user 01 through user 15, and there's a little formula for the password, whatever. So you can choose any of those. I mean, I don't think it really much matters. I just happen to have 15 of them for training classes and stuff. And what you'll find, if you do log in there, you'll find that you can give the command Ruby, which will be 186, or you can give the command Ruby 187 or IRB 187, and you'll be in 187, and 190 or IRB 190. So if you want to kind of, try things out, play along, you're welcome to do that. Again, it's not one of the big, it's not scaled to, it's not set up to trigger more instances if 600 people sign on. So, we'll try it out and see if it survives. But yeah, by all means, have a look at that. I am also happy. I've actually been, somewhat immersed in especially 1.9, just because I'm writing about it. So I'm happy. I can do as much or as little kind of showing you specific things in 1.9 as you're interested in. And again, I want to kind of circle all this back also to Rails and versions of Rails and kind of targeting of what you do and what you should do and what you might do and so on. Now, I'm interested just by a show of hands. How many of you are primarily running Ruby 1.8.6? Okay, how about 187 as your main Ruby? Okay. 1.9 point anything as your main Ruby? Wait, you can't have two main Rubies. That's no fair. Or did you just change in that second from one to the other? Okay. But actually, now you're Give this man a microphone. Yeah, I'll be interested actually if you have things about your experience with those versions. Certainly, anyone who's using 187. How many of you have tried 187 but haven't been, have kind of found it interesting, but you're not sort of switching over to it for one reason or another? And what about 1.9? How many of you have never looked at 1.9? Oh, I see. Okay. How many of you would like to see a kind of whirlwind tour of some things in 1.9? That's, please, since I put it that way, I wish more of you would raise your hand. I will actually. At some point, I'll try to show you a few important things because there's a million changes and kind of a big handful of pretty important ones that if you're writing Ruby code, you really need to know about. I will actually demo a bit of that. Meanwhile, as I say, you can play around on the EC2 image, try out the IRB thing, find out what works. Try string.each, for example, in 1.9. Might get an interesting result. All right, I have planted microphones in the audience. And there is one in the hands of Jeremy Kemper and one in the hands of Adam Keyes, my lovely assistants. Thank you very much. What I'd like to do, we have two microphones, a big room, hundreds of people. So we have to fight for this a little bit. But what I'd like to do is, if people have comments or questions or answers in the Symposium tradition, such as it is, I'd like to kind of hand off the torch, so to speak, sort of hand the microphones around, and whoever speaks, if you can kind of hand it to the next person who raises their hand and so on. It'll give us all some exercise. Well, I'll give you some exercise. So let's see, 187. Who said that they tried 187 but not found it, not sort of leapt onto it? I know some of you raised your hands. Those people have left? Is that what you're telling me? Adam, how about you? That should just come, it should be on, and I think...
Sibilance, yes.
Yeah.
I haven't tried 187. I've played with 1.9.
Uh-huh.
And some of the 1.9 only stuff, like RevActor, is pretty cool.
Like what?
RevActor.
Uh-huh.
It's a actor-based concurrency.
Right,
gizmo.
that only runs on 1.9.
Yeah, it uses fibers, which are pretty neat. But that's the extent of it.
Okay, so you're running 186.
Yes.
Pretty much, right.
The never block stuff. I don't know if you guys have seen blog entries.
Wait, is yours on? Is Jeremy's mic on? Or am I?
I can't tell. Is it on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
I don't know if you guys have seen the blog entries about never block. There have been a couple going around looking at actually scaling Rails, and you have this problem where the C APIs, when you make database calls or even do things like socket writes, those block the entire Ruby process. And in 1.9 we have native threads, and so this is one of the big promises of having native threads, is that you can do things like multiple database calls at the same time without locking. And it also uses fibers. So there's some pretty cool things out there with 1.9 that people could try. I'm kind of curious whether anybody's really kind of pushing the bounds with Ruby, or whether everybody's just treating it as a platform. And that's kind of where 186 is right now.
So if people, can the volume on that mic go up a little bit? I can barely hear it.
Yeah, I was curious whether people are pushing the bounds with Ruby, are really running into any difficulties with different Ruby versions, or just treating Ruby as a platform and wanting it to just stay the same and predictable and not really, throw any surprises up. But has anybody run into trouble with a Ruby version? Maybe even 1.8.5 or 1.8.3 was kind of a skipped release.
Tell us your tale of woe.
Yeah, I'm Mike from 5runs. We run 186, and I guess to your point, we're pretty much treating Ruby as a platform. But one thing that's concerned us lately is the stability of 186 with the security patches that have come out. they've introduced memory leaks and some crashes in Rails. So it's been difficult to try and find a Ruby VM that has the security fixes and yet at the same time it is stable.
Right. What are you? I mean, if it's not a corporate secret, you may have your own little patches or something. But what are you running now? I mean, are you?
I'd have to kill you.
So yeah.
Sorry. No, we're running we're running 287 with the latest security fixes, and
That's
we're just
patch level 287. Right?
yes,
Yeah.
186 28. Yeah, but we're using Monet to monitor the memory, and then just simply killing the daemons when the memory leaks get too bad, and just restarting things. So it's a temporary solution, and it's workable, but it's not the best solution.
Yeah, I actually had an experience recently with 186. I think it was patch level 230, which was not perfect, I guess. But what happened was I just have a small website. I've got a little Rails app on my server that's for a friend of mine, who just wanted a website because she'd published a book and stuff. And anyway, there it is. And I'd set up with using Active Scaffold. I'd set up a little admin thing for her so she could enter publicity events and stuff connected with her book. It stopped working, and whenever you went to admin login, it just all the mongrels died and everything died. And it was kind of hard to track down because it turned out there was an incompatibility, I think, with active support on 2.1 or something. Rails 2.1, something I'd set up where it was kind of balking at something. Then I fixed that, and it was still happening, and it turned out to be some kind of error in Ruby in the binary. I can't remember exactly what it was, but basically Ruby was crashing as well. And eventually I tracked that down and updated to patch level 287, and that worked out well. Just out of curiosity, I'm just wondering, and I see you've got the mic there. Just one thing while it's in my head: how many of you compile your Rubies from source? Okay, and how many of you use like a an apt-get or whatever, RPM or something? Yeah. All right. Yeah, compiling from source, I know it interferes with some of the file layout of these things. I mean, that's kind of an internal issue. But depending on your distribution and how up-to-date they are, it's sometimes not a bad idea. If you do hear about, security issues, hopefully the distribution archives would update them quickly. But it's a good skill to have. I see a microphone. Yes.
I would like to second the opinion of the last speaker because usually I'm one of the guys who tries the latest patches and all that stuff. And but I was really disappointed with Ruby after going beyond 1.1.4 patch level because I tried the security fixes as well, and all my spec tests went like hell. And so the same experience with 1.8.7 when I tried some gems, which didn't work out either. And as it's a pleasant experience that so many people are working here on the Mac, and usually 1.1.4 patch level is the pre-installed environment, and I suppose lots of people are developing on Mac and deploying on Linux or whatever, and it's really a hassle to keep all these minor patch versions on the same level. Oh, do you running 1.1.4? My spec test doesn't fail. No, I'm running 2.1.6 or whatever. So I think they didn't do a real good job in doing this release management, and if so many things change and break so many gems, and if usually when I go to a last version in a patch level, I don't expect that my whole app breaks. And I think they disappointed lots of people with their release management. And so I'm sticking in 1.1.4 until lots of blogs are saying, okay, this is the next true release, stick to it, or perhaps Apple adopts it or whatever.
And again, 1.1.4 patch level as opposed to Ruby 1.1.4.
Exactly. Right. That's the thing we are using. And it would be really a hassle to compile your own Ruby on all the Mac machines and all that stuff.
Yeah. It's, I know what you mean about people feeling kind of disappointed and frustrated by it. It's a difficult situation because, like, if you follow the Ruby core mailing list, I mean, there's a lot of work going into this. It's not like anyone's kind of abandoned the Ruby code base or whatever, but it's just a lot of things coming at them and a lot of different things. And I think part of my issue with 1.8.7, again, 1.8.7 is basically 1.8 with a lot of 1.9 features backported. One of my issues with it is honestly, I shouldn't sort of second guess what the core Ruby people are doing because, I'm sort of on the sides cheerleading for the most part. But it felt a little bit like maybe the energy could go more into 1.9 or keeping 186 stable or whatever. And 187, in that sense, has always felt to me like it's probably never going to really get used all that much, I think. That's my impression. By the way, I'm not prescribing. I'm not sort of saying, oh, don't use 187. I just, from talking to people and kind of observing.
Hey, David, maybe you could give some examples of breakage moving from 186 to 187. What are the kinds of things that you'll run into and will actually, make your app crash?
App crash? Well, let's see. I am not sure. Are you using 187? I can't remember what you said.
I use 187 in development.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I have nothing. I don't consider it a sort of throwaway or no good release. Since its main thing is that it does a lot of 1.9 stuff. I'm just not sure why it exists. I guess that's my main issue with it.
Does anybody else have an idea why?
Yes, I just want to say, in my experience in Debian, you can only use 187. Ever since the security vulnerabilities, I upgraded to the new patch level, and you just cannot even run script server. Just fails memory underflow, I think. So I had to upgrade to 187. I had no choice.
Sorry, which one fails? What?
186 patch level,
okay.
230, I think, for the security.
Yeah, 230.
Yeah.
That's the one that I was using when I ran into that problem with the, like a buffer overflow or something. Yeah. Have you looked at the higher patch levels of 286?
No, I just stayed with 187 actually.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Now, Jeremy, I'm open to being persuaded otherwise. I mean, if I'm being too negative or sort of indifferent to 187, am I just resisting the future? Is that what?
I think probably in some part, but
Yeah.
but it is being foisted upon you. So,
I mean, I guess part of it is kind of a personal thing. I mean, I really like Ruby 1.8. I mean, there's a lot of cool stuff in 1.9. I think 1.8 is a great language and a great thing as it is. And so, I guess it would be kind of cool to see another iteration of 1.8 that was sort of a full-blooded 1.8, so to speak.
I think. Do you think any of that has to do with having experienced the transition from 1.6 to 1.8? Because that was far more orderly. It felt like it just fit within the Ruby world, and everybody understood what was going on. There was no giant breakage.
Yeah.
The bridge release was easy to work with. The whole 1.7 series.
Well, that's actually, speaking of the 1.7 series, I mean, for those of you who don't know, part of the history of this, and I think part of what's contributed to this being a particularly, kind of difficult transition in some ways, is from 1.3 and 5, back then, right, pre-1.8, when you had an odd number as the second number, like 1.5 or 1.7, those are explicitly development releases. They were not production releases, and the even numbers were production. And then when they got to 1.9, they're not going to do a 1.10. So, and I can't remember the exact rationale, but whatever. In the numbering system, the idea was to go to 1.9 and then 2.0. Sorry?
That's because you can't do it in C. It's limited to a single-digit version numbers.
Sorry, I didn't get.
It's limited to single-digit.
Yeah,
version
right,
numbers.
right. So you have 1.7, which was the development release, 1.8, which was a production release, 1.9, which is kind of, again, I'm not exactly sure whether it's like eventually a production release, but I think it's put kind of backward pressure on 1.8 to be a kind of interim release and so forth. And 2.0, I honestly have not heard much talk about Ruby 2.0 lately. I think it will be much like 1.9. I mean, I think that's part of the idea. But yeah, I mean, I'm not sort of anti 1.87. I find myself not kind of leaping to go to it as I normally would, like from 1.85 to 1.86. So it just feels like such a big change, and and more relevant to 1.9 than it is to 1.8.
Well, one thing I find kind of interesting is that there are so many blog posts and people out there trying other languages, and Erlang is kind of the new hotness now. But so many folks raising their hands not trying Ruby 1.9. It seems like such an easy leap, and just to go see the new things that are happening in Ruby. And if everybody's going out and seeing what's happening in other languages, why not see what the future of Ruby holds also? So I'm kind of curious why folks aren't trying that out.
What are you, chicken?
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah, why aren't you trying out 1.9? Is it just that you've sort of got the tools you need and the kind of life cycle of Ruby per se is not high on your to-do list?
Maybe we got someone back here.
Yes.
Yeah, well, I kind of tried 1.9, but it breaks a lot of gems, so I prefer to stay on the stable side.
There is a gem issue with 1.9. Now I'm forgetting what it was. Something in the C API that changed. I can't remember what it was. It may be more than one thing. But a lot of gems that use C extensions, most of them don't compile.
Yeah.
And I'm actually, to be honest, I'm not sure where that stands. I mean, my memory of that is from a few months ago. But
Actually, that is a pretty common experience when you're trying a new library or a gem with 1.9. There's just a short little list of things that most things will need changed before they work on 1.9. So it can be pretty frustrating. That's a pretty good reason.
yeah, I would say 1.9 at this point is still, kind of explorative territory. I mean, it's not just a drop-in replacement for 1.8.6. Jeremy, while I have you here, just coming back to the subject of Rails, I mean, are you guys, how are you sort of meshing with these versions at this point? And I guess that also leads to the question of not only the versions, but the different implementations. But I'm just curious about the Rails code base and whether you're, how you're approaching that in terms of the 1.9 features, are moving toward that, staying 1.8.6 compatible, and so on.
We use active support as kind of a compatibility layer. So there are a lot of things even introduced within the 1.8 series for things like introspection on whether, say, an instance variable is defined that didn't exist earlier in the 1.8 series. But those are the kinds of things that we can introduce in active support just as kind of a shim to backport them. And similarly, there are quite a few things that are in 1.9 that we've backported that are kind of new features that we can all rely on now. So when you're using Rails, it's actually the Ruby experience is more consistent across Ruby versions. So that's what we've been trying to do. Mm-hmm. Doing it with 1.9 is a little more difficult because there are some more basic changes like having string encodings. And that's pervasive. You have to deal with string encodings everywhere. And that's much more difficult to just transparently support.
Right.
But I'd say on the gem and library front, things have gotten way, way better too. All the database drivers work, Mongrel works, Hprocot works. So all of the common stuff has already been updated. So if you tried it, say, months ago, if you try it again, I think you probably have a better experience.
All right. Would you go so far as to recommend it? What's your recommended, if I'm not putting you on the spot, what's your...
I think 1.9 is pretty cool, and it's fun to mess around with it, especially some of the new features and seeing where Matt's is going with what he's interested in Ruby. And some of the new syntax changes, like having new ways of specifying lambdas. He's trying to make functions more first class, and that's something that really never existed in Ruby before, and I think maybe he's regretted not having that.
The Stabby lambda, is that what you're thinking?
Yeah.
I'll show. Have some of you seen the Stabby lambda? I think it's time for some code. Yeah! All right. All right, here we are. Let's see. I need to be somewhere where I have... Whoops, sorry. Come back, little screen. Where do I have... Yeah, I think... No, I do have 1.9 here. Okay. Let's have a look at... Is that big enough, almost? Yes, no... How's that? How's that? Bigger? It's so funny how the people in the back say bigger and the people in the front say it's okay. Who'd have thought? All right, I think that should do it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into a fairly recent, well, actually, which one is this? That's not what I mean. What is it? Oh, there is a release date or something, but
Do you have tab completion?
What is it?
Don't you have tab completion?
No. Well, we'll just, oh, there we go. Yeah, so that's reasonably recent sort of Ruby trunk version. Okay, the Stabby lambda thing. Now, actually, one of the things that's been being dealt with a lot in Ruby as it's gone along and still is being dealt with is the matter of, and this is where you'll see this leads into the Stabby proc, the matter of block variables and block parameters. For example, if I say, let's just, for a moment, let's just go into regular 186 IRB. Now, as you probably know, or if you don't, it's about time you did. If I say A equals 1, and then I say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, each A, put S, A, right, whatever. Now I have my original A equal to 5. Because, as of Ruby 1.8, block assignment or block parameter binding is done using assignment semantics. So I'm basically saying when you say pipe A pipe, it's basically like saying A equals each of these things. And if A already exists, then it's that A. So in other words, it gets clobbered. Okay, in 1.9, if you say each A, the existing A is not the same A. So the block parameter A is its own thing. Now, if I say 1, 2, 3 each n, A equals n, now that is the same A because that A is not a parameter. That's just a variable from the local scope, and that gets closed into the block as it would have in 186. So if you actually manipulate a variable from outside inside, then it will work that way. I really think I'd put that number 1 on the list of things that have been kind of argued about and talked about and agonized over in the last 8 years in Ruby. Anyway, it's now this way. So those block parameters do not clobber the outer ones. Now, a remaining question about block parameter syntax is the doing something like, actually I think it will work in that one. So here's where it won't work. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 each A. Now let's say I want to say, I mean this is kind of a dinky example because it will never, well it won't compile actually. You know, let's say A, and then I want an optional argument of B equals 10. So B, if not assigned, should be 10. And you would do that in a method signature, right? Now sadly, you couldn't do that in a block because block parameters used assignment syntax, not method argument syntax. So A comma B equals 10 is a way to give a default argument to a method, but you'd end up with sort of B equals 10 equals something. It doesn't work, or didn't work for block parameters. In other words, you couldn't use exactly, for method arguments you had one set of rules, and for block parameters between the pipes you had another set of rules. And Mats has always said that he wanted a way to create anonymous functions, in other words procs or lambdas, which you create using block syntax, a way to create those with method argument semantics. Now, I believe, let's just put this belief to the test. I think it's possible. No, okay, so that's not there is a patch that I think is going to go in that will do that. But anyway, meanwhile, since you was that I am in 1.9. Yes, okay. Whatever. Yeah, I'm in the same. Okay, so you can't do that in 1.9, but there is a patch that I think may make that possible. Meanwhile, in order to accomplish this goal, in other words, in order to have anonymous functions that used method argument semantics, so you could have optional arguments at the end of your argument list. They Mats and colleagues came up with a new notation to create a function or a lambda. And here it is. We'll say func equals pointy thing. That's why we call it the Stabby lambda, right? Arrow-looking thing. Argument list that uses method argument semantics, not the pipe parameter semantics of blocks. And then a block like this. So I could say put s, a plus b. Now if I say func.call 10, b will default to 1, just as it would if that were a method. So the Stabby lambda is basically creating, as you can see from the little screen dump there, it's basically creating a lambda object, which is a close cousin of the proc object. But it does have method argument semantics. So that's one of the new things in 1.9. It's a little bit controversial because it's a bit line noisy. I mean, it's a bit kind of punctuation heavy, but it does accomplish that. Now again, stay tuned because I think that Eric Mahurin wrote a patch that, I mean, the issue, by the way, if you're wondering why can't they just have it work here? If you're the parser, what you see is A, comma, and then B equals 10 pipe. Now the pipe could be a bitwise OR operator. So the parser has trouble figuring out whether you're going to say, B equals 10 or 3. It's very, edge case doesn't even begin to describe how unlikely it is that you would do that. I think, though, that Eric Mahurin wrote a patch that comes close to, to making the parser see that that's the pipe that matches the other pipe. Anyway, meanwhile, we have the Stabby proc, so that's that. And so if you need methods, it's handy if you do define method, which is a meta-programming way of creating a new method. It's kind of akin to the def keyword, except it uses a block to define the body of your method instead of a def block. And how many of you have used define method? Some of you, yeah. Well, define method, one of the problems with define method is since it uses a block to represent the body of the method, and blocks don't use method argument semantics, you couldn't create methods with optional arguments and things like that if you do that. So there's kind of a mismatch between the goal of writing a method and the semantics, which did not allow for method argument syntax. Let's see, while I'm here, what's another cool Ruby 1.9?
Another is the new hash syntax.
Oh, right. Yeah, the new hash syntax. You can go like this. Let's go all out. We'll have 3. Now look at what I've done here. A:1, B:2, C:3. What have I done wrong? What's that? I thought this, Jeremy, doesn't this turn this into symbols?
Yeah, you're in 187. You're in 187 right now.
Oh. I meant to do that. Okay. Right. That doesn't work in 187 or 186 or whatever it was. There we go. So this is a way to say, if you look at the second line, that's what you would have to, right, they are symbols, but what happens here is that this new notation of A:, just interprets that as the symbol A and as a hash key. And that's going to be nice also if you call methods, my method, name, David, age, 28, and so on, right? So it's just, I did that, sorry, force of habit. It's just not in my fingers yet. I did that backwards, right? Name, that's the whole point. You do it here. So something like that. So it's, you've seen, of course, many times the hash argument syntax where you can put a hash as the last argument of a method call and not put braces around it and so on. But now you don't even have to write the little arrow if you're using symbols as keys. I mean, it automatically turns them into symbols. There's also basic object. This is a little bit far afield from anything you might have to do kind of every day. The hash thing you might do every day. But I really like basic object, and I just want to show you basic object. In Ruby 1.9, let's say you have a class and you look at its ancestors. Notice, now forget about readline, which is just from IRB, right? That wouldn't normally be there. But the ancestors of string include comparable, object, kernel, and basic object. Now, notice, just a little footnote, strings are not enumerable anymore. There's no enumerable among the ancestors, so that's a change. Basic object, have some of you used XML Builder? Yes, no, yes, some of you have. Okay, XML Builder is the XML templating library by Jim Weirich. And the way it works basically, and you'll see why this is relevant to this. The way it works is that if you basically have an XML writer object and you say, x.person and a block, and it creates an XML tag person. So any method you call becomes an XML tag. So it kind of maps the XML you want onto a kind of nested series of method calls with blocks. Now, what if you want a tag called inspect or something, and it happens to be already a Ruby method? The problem is you need your XML object to basically have almost no methods so that you can choose pretty much any method to be an XML tag. And Jim Weirich actually wrote a class called blank slate that essentially an instance of blank slate undefines almost every method other than like __ send and a couple of others. So you can call any method on it, and it will turn, by catching it in method missing, it will turn it into an XML tag, and you don't have to worry about, did this object, am I clashing with an existing Ruby method name? Now, basic object is very similar to Jim Weirich's blank slate. In fact, I would say it was to some extent inspired by it. And a basic object has almost no methods. And in fact, what's really funny is if you create one, I mentioned in spec, IRB tries to show it to you, and it can't because there's no inspect method, right? And if you say, well, does it exist? It can't inspect it. How about, what are its methods? It has no methods. Right? You can, however, say basic object instance, methods, and address it through the class. And you see it's just a very small kind of survival kit of methods that an object might need. So basic object, it's now kind of the top of the Ruby tree in 1.9. And you might, those of you who write sort of DSL style things where you use method missing to interpret messages and so on, it could come in handy because it's basically a pretty clean slate object.
Actually, this is used in Rails in a couple of places. In active record associations, those are all proxy objects that pass through their methods to underlying collection and load from the database on the fly. And we used something very similar to blank slate. Also the JavaScript generators used in RJS. So it's an example of how we're trying to do forward compatibility. We actually use a basic object in active support that in 1.9 uses the native basic object, but in 1.8.7 uses blank slate.
So you've changed. You're updating it to use basic object in 1.9. Yeah. And I think it's, it took me a little while to at first I kind of thought, well, maybe object should be the empty one, and then there should be one called, full object. It felt a little bit, but I've actually come to think this is right. That basic object is really the top of the tree, and you can do pretty much whatever you want with it. Have any of you used enumerators? Well, they're a complex topic. I'm going to show you like one example of an enumerator. They're pretty. I find them kind of difficult to get my head around, but when you do, they're, I think, kind of interesting. An enumerator is an object. Duh. This is Ruby. An enumerator is an object, and it's enumerable. Enumerables respond to each, and they have methods on them like select and inject and find and reject and all that. The difference is, okay, let's say we have a nice little array, and then we say we're going to have an enumerator, and we'll say enum for, how about, well, let's make it easy. How about map? I now have an enumerator, and this enumerator is hooked up to my array, and it is hooked up to the map method. What that means is that if I say, for example, e.each, and I say, each n, and I say n times 10. Now, normally, if you just looked at that last line, each generally just does some side effects and returns its receiver and so on. What happens here is that because E, the enumerator, is already kind of plugged into my array, and specifically the map method of my array, the each method on the enumerator is basically the map method from that array object. So even though it's an each and you wouldn't expect it to do a mapping, I actually get back a mapping because this enumerator has combined knowledge. It knows what object it represents, and it knows what method it represents. Now, why do we do this? Because you can do things like, let's see. Well, actually, one thing you'll find in 1.9 is that if you do each without a block, or map without a block, or lots of other things without a block, you get back an enumerator. Unlike previous Rubies, where if I do an array.each, I get yelled at. If I do an array.map, I just get a mapping of nothing. So here I get back an enumerator. One thing it means is that you can actually chain these. So, for instance, the holy grail of map with index, which many of us have been pleading for years and years. You now, in 1.9, have map dot with index. And what that will do is it will give you the item in the array and the index and do a mapping. And now we have already each with index, but now we have map dot with index. So, whatever. I multiply the number or the item times its index. Just, again, I get a mapping of that.
This is a great example of that 187 breakage. In 186, when you do that array.map, you get an array right back. But in 187, you get an enumerator back, which breaks tons of code.
Yeah, right. That is a good example of where, 1.87 is taking something from 1.9 that really does feel like too much of a breakage from, sort of departure from 186. I mean, I expect, all these versions to be different and to have to maybe modify some code, but 187 really is very different from 186, in some ways like that. So anyway, I mean, again, did any of you log into that EC2 instance? Anybody got on there? Okay. Did anyone try and not get on? Try and it didn't work? No? Okay. So yeah, you can play around with this stuff there.
Did anybody load up those different IRBs and go, hey, it's Ruby? I mean, not much is different.
It's true. I mean, if you're in like IRB, here we're in IRB 1.9. It is, yeah. I mean, it's Ruby. There's nothing. It's it's not sort of foreign territory. One thing you'll find is that in 1.9 there's just a lot more methods also. Like the enumerable module has a whole bunch of new methods. Like there's one called each const. So if I say each const 3, sorry, that doesn't really show you much. You know what? Let's cheat. I'll just say 2 array. Each const 3 gives you 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 4, 3, 4, 5. So if you need to step through a collection, getting n number of things at a time, but not. There's also each slice, which does the same thing, but without repeating. And so there's a ton of new methods in Ruby 1.9 in enumerable and elsewhere. Just switching gears for a moment, is anybody here very conversant with the Ruby spec project? Is anyone here somewhat conversant with the Ruby spec project? Has anyone here heard of the Ruby spec project? There we go. Okay. Yeah, I'm somewhere between having heard of it and a little bit conversant. I really haven't looked at it in great depth. But basically the idea of the Ruby spec project is, and I think, Jeremy, did you mention this? Or it's been mentioned.
In the core panel when we were talking about targeting different Rubies.
Okay, right. The basic idea is to create a kind of battery of tests or specifications that will define at least kind of a core Ruby functionality that will be, that will be represented in all the different implementations. Is anyone here involved in JRuby or Rubinius? Who's he? I can't see who that is. Who is that? Yes. Who are you? Yes.
It's a room.
Give that man a microphone. What I'm curious about, again, just switching gears a little bit, and anyone who's interested in more kind of 1.9 hacking and stuff, I'd be glad to talk to you at some point because it is very interesting. But I'm just, now sorry, I can't see, who are you?
My name is Arun Gupta. I work for Sun Microsystems.
Hi, so you're involved in JRuby?
I work with the JRuby guys pretty closely.
Right. I'm just curious, since we have, again, we've got kind of 3 threads here, Rails, Ruby, MRI, matches Ruby, and the versions, whatever that's going through at the moment. And then the other kind of counterpoint to this is the different Ruby implementations, especially, I say especially JRuby and Rubinius just because they're the ones that are, I think getting kind of the most mature and the most press and so on, and probably most users. But I'm just curious how that plays out. I mean, like, is JRuby looking ahead at 1.9? Is it, sort of targeting 1.8.6? Is it targeting the Ruby spec project? And is that moving to 1.9? Sort of where does that all play out in terms of the implementations?
Sure. So yesterday, Tom Anebo actually gave a talk, and there he talked about, JRuby, first of all, is just Ruby. I mean, that's how we always want to project it as. You don't need to know Java to use JRuby. That's the first clarification I would like to make.
You need to know how to type the letter J, basically.
That's it.
Right.
Whatever J could understand for you, you don't need to know Java. That's about it. JRuby, first of all, 1.1.4, which was released around a couple of weeks ago, is 1.8.6 compliant. There are 33,000 tests and 33,000 assertions and 22,000 internal tests that we have that makes it actually compliant with Ruby 1.8.6. In a chat with Tom Anebo yesterday, I figured out that these guys are already targeting 1.9, so work has already started in that effort. And as we saw by the show of hands, the biggest percentage of people who are using here is still 1.8.6. So right. Our main focus is 1.8.6. The subsequent releases, the JRuby cycle is like 4 to 6 weeks now. We do that release frequently, keeping the agile model. And the biggest focus is really to do the performance improvements, leverage on all the work that has been done in the Java VM, and fix all the incompatibilities, as and when user figures it out or reports it, either on the JRuby alias or the IRC channel, which is pretty active. Mm-hmm. And talking in terms of Rails, well, I have 1.2.6, I have 2.0.2, now 2.0.4, and I actually have 2.1, and they all run pretty fine over there. Yesterday, I was trying Edge Rails on JRuby as well. And again, Tom actually reported those numbers. So if you're running JRuby 1.1.3 with Edge Rails, and if you're running JRuby 1.1.3 with, say, Rails 2.1, the difference is huge. Just to quote some numbers, for a simple hello world, it's no benchmark by any standards. Your production applications are never hello world. But just to quote some numbers, if you're running a hello world with 1,000 requests, 10 concurrency, the memory footprint for 2.1 was 200 megabytes to begin with, and it ended with a total heap size of 233 megabytes at the end of all the requests. If you do the same thing with Rails 2.2, which is actually going to be multi-threaded, thread safe, JRuby, I think, is going to gain the most out of it. And the way it's going to work is the memory footprint is down from 200 to 50 megabytes, same number of requests, same concurrency, and the heap size at the end of the game is like 55 megabytes. So we're already seeing 75% performance improvement and memory size, and there is still work to be done.
And now that came from going from Rails 2.1 to Rails Edge?
That's right.
But on the same JRuby
Exactly same
platform?
JRuby.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. And
note to self. Yeah.
Yeah. And another key improvement is there's a lot of work that keeps going on within the Java VM itself for performance improvements. So just by moving from JDK 1.5 to JDK 1.6, nothing that JRuby did or Ruby did or Rails did, we actually gained significant improvement because the JVM itself, did a lot of performance improvements. Right. So work happens at all different layers, and end of the game, we see JRuby benefiting.
Right. Now, what is the relationship between JRuby and the Ruby spec project? I know Ruby spec project is hosted, I believe, by the Rubinius project, which is part of Engine Yard and so on. But what is your kind of relation to that project in terms? You said you had 33,000 tests. Are they related to the Ruby spec tests, or are they, kind of different, or a superset or subset?
Sure. So the tests are 22,000. That's part of the JRuby workspace. The 33 assertions, those are from the Ruby spec in that sense. So we pass all of those, and think about 55,000 tests in all, just to ensure compliance with the Ruby specification.
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, thanks. That's interesting. The whole question of kind of specifying the Ruby language comes up periodically, and I've always thought it was probably best to do it this way. I think it's such a cool thing to have basically an enormous test suite or spec suite rather than kind of just a kind of printed whatever sort of description or definition of the language. Because it's just more in the nature of Ruby somehow. It's like this is what actually happens, as opposed to this is just some kind of formula for what should happen. But yeah, and it does give this kind of unity, and it may make all this 1.9 stuff much more sort of cogent, or as the different versions, implementations, everybody kind of moves forward with that.
Right.
Cool.
So I would like to leave with the last note. JRuby is just Ruby. You don't need to know Java. If you're using Ruby on Rails, we have tried lots of different popular applications. Anywhere from Typo to Mephisto to Redmine to Substruct. All of those work absolutely fine without any migration effort whatsoever. Yeah. So give it a spin.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks. All right, I'd like to open up to questions. If anybody, again, sort of, I've been doing a lot of cloud computing, EC2 and stuff. So I think that influenced my vision of the Symposium, because I think of it as kind of an undifferentiated mass of questions and answers. And I don't care where they come from. So, and I think it's kind of cool. In that vein, and we're getting, somewhat toward the end of our time, aren't we? Yes. Yeah. Okay. But if there are any questions, based on what we've been talking about, or just any other things that you want to bring up, we could open it up to that for a couple of minutes. Yes. Oh. About what? Fibers. Ray, our time is up. There was about a 48-hour period where I knew a lot about fibers, and it was a few months ago. Anybody a fiber?
Fibers are they're coroutines, so they're kind of like Python generators. There's something similar in Lua and other languages, where you're running a little piece of code, and then you can yield control. In a full coroutine, you can actually yield control to another coroutine, so you can use it as a form of flow control. In Ruby, it's actually kind of like a partial, like a semi-coroutine, because you can only return control back to the caller. But it gives your Ruby program itself the ability to schedule execution. So it's as if you have a green thread in Ruby 1.8, except you're doing all the scheduling yourself. So people are doing some pretty neat things in Ruby 1.9 with these fibers, like the NeverBlock library. It's actually running database queries in a fiber, and then when it wants to grab the results, it yields the fiber to say, go complete your execution. So it's, rather than leaving it up to the whim of the Ruby thread scheduler, instead it's all managing it itself. So it gives you a lot of flexibility with how you're managing parallel threads of execution.
I believe that enumerators are built on top of fibers, or did I dream that? I think they are, or were. We can check out that, but yeah, they're sort of in the general family of threads and such, but yeah, they have their own kind of semantics. Anything else? Any last? I think this will probably be a last question, Stefan.
I know that I'm slightly bending this theme of versions, but where's the next version of RubyConf Europe, RailsConf Europe, going to happen? Or is it too early to ask that question?
It's a little too early. So yeah, Gina, is it a little too early? The question, yeah, it's a little too early. There are sort of clouds floating, ideas in the clouds. But yeah, we haven't planned anything yet, but we'll keep everyone posted, definitely. All right, well, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.